Imagine a nation's entire strategic playbook, decades in the making, burning to the ground in just over a single month. It sounds like the plot of a political thriller, but it is exactly what we are looking at right now. We are diving into a fascinating, frankly chilling strategic analysis report detailing the fallout of the US-Israel-Iran war that kicked off in late February 2026.
It really is a watershed moment in modern geopolitics. We are talking about a conflict that saw nearly 900 combined strikes in a matter of weeks. The sheer scale of the devastation is hard to wrap your head around. Missile infrastructure, air defenses, nuclear facilities, and even the highest echelons of regime leadership, including the reported elimination of the supreme leader, were systematically dismantled.
And that brings us to where we are right now, in early April 2026. There is a fragile, 2-week ceasefire on the table. The Strait of Hormuz is temporarily reopening, and negotiations are set to begin in Islamabad. But the core argument of the analysis we are unpacking today is that this pause is just a band-aid. The only real way out for Iran isn't just stopping the shooting, but undergoing a fundamental, systemic reset.
Exactly. The report makes an incredibly compelling case that what Iran needs right now is a transitional government. And it uses 4 classic strategic frameworks, MOST, PESTEL, SPEAR, and SWOT, to prove that continuing this war is mathematically and strategically impossible. It's a brilliant way to look at a geopolitical crisis, applying boardroom strategy models to national survival.
Let's break those down, because applying corporate strategy to a war zone is such a fascinating lens. Starting with MOST mission, objectives, strategy, and tactics. The regime's original mission was to defend its structure, keep its nuclear program, and project power through proxy networks. But the report argues that mission has completely detached from reality, right?
Completely. It is like a chess player trying to execute a grand offensive when they only have a king and 1 pawn left on the board. The regime's short-term objective was to inflict pain, primarily by disrupting global shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. The long-term goal was to force a U.S. withdrawal, but the tactics, missile barrages, and closing the strait spectacularly backfired. Instead of outlasting the adversary, they accelerated their own economic collapse and got their critical defense and steel production wiped out.
It is the classic trap of asymmetric warfare, isn't it? The assumption that you can just absorb punches until the other guy gets tired. But that strategy falls apart when the other guy has the technological capability to dismantle your entire nervous system in a month.
That is the perfect analogy. The strategy of endurance was built for a marathon, but they were hit by a technological lightning bolt. The MOST analysis concludes that the current mission is a suicide pact. A transitional government, on the other hand, would allow the nation to draft a brand new mission: reconstruction, reintegration, and economic survival. It reframes concession not as waving a white flag, but as the ultimate act of national preservation.
Which naturally bleeds into the macro picture. The PESTEL analysis. Political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal factors. And looking at this, it seems every single macro force is acting like a gravitational pull, dragging the current regime down. Politically, the isolation is absolute. Even traditional allies are backing away, urging de-escalation.
And economically, it is a catastrophe. Pre-war sanctions had already hollowed out the economy, but these recent strikes, they hit the arteries. Karg Island, steel mills, transport bridges. Closing the Strait of Hormuz cost them billions in lost oil revenue while simultaneously uniting the globe against them. You cannot rebuild an economy when you are locked out of the global banking system and your infrastructure is smoking rubble.
The social and environmental costs really struck me too. We often talk about geopolitics as a game of chess, but there is a profound human tragedy here. Thousands dead, mass displacement, cultural heritage sites damaged, and the environmental angle is something people rarely discuss in wartime.
It is a phenomenal point. The strikes on industrial sites in places like Khuzestan are creating long-term pollution and resource degradation. This is a country already facing severe water stress and climate challenges. War diverts every single resource away from climate adaptation and pours it into a losing battle. And socially, the civilian toll is eroding whatever domestic support the regime had left. People are exhausted. A transitional government could actually channel that massive social unrest into legitimate structured reform instead of letting the country slide into total chaos.
It really makes you wonder about the deep, philosophical cost of resistance. When the price of resisting is the literal poisoning of your land and the destruction of your future generations' prosperity, what exactly are you saving?
That is the existential question. And from a legal standpoint, the current leadership is staring down the barrel of war crimes, scrutiny, and even tighter UN sanctions. A new, internationally recognized interim authority could reset that legal standing, open up frameworks for reparations, and bring the country back into the community of nations.
So the environment is toxic in every sense of the word. Let's pivot to the SPEAR framework: strategy, planning, execution, assessment, and review. This is all about the gap between what you want to do and what actually happens. Where did the disconnect happen for Iran's leadership?
Everywhere. The entire strategy execution loop collapsed. Their planning relied heavily on dispersed assets and proxy militias, but they completely failed to anticipate the sheer intensity and precision of the decapitation strikes. They didn't plan for their command nodes to vanish overnight, so when it came to execution, their missile salvos achieved some temporary disruption, but the cost was catastrophic.
It sounds like they were operating on outdated metrics. If your real-time battlefield assessment is showing that your key missile groups are gone, your air defenses are blind, and your proxies are neutralized, how can your review process possibly conclude that you should keep fighting?
It cannot. Any honest internal review would have to admit that the current leadership structure is incapable of delivering a recovery. The feedback loop is broken. A transitional government would essentially reboot that computer. It would allow for a fresh SPEAR cycle, a realistic strategy focused on peace, detailed planning for international aid, and transparent execution of reconstruction.
It is fascinating how these sterile, corporate-sounding frameworks paint such a vivid picture of a collapsing state. That brings us to the final piece of the puzzle: SWOT. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Do they have any strengths left at this point?
They do, but they are incredibly hollow. They have geographic depth, a historical narrative of resistance that still resonates with a core group of supporters, and some residual asymmetric capabilities. But those strengths are completely dwarfed by their weaknesses. The military-industrial base is gone. There is a massive leadership vacuum,
which makes the threats almost existential. If the Islamabad talks fail, and the US and Israel resume strikes, especially since they have explicitly threatened power plants and energy grids, if Hormuz stays closed, that could mean the literal fragmentation of the state.
Exactly. That is the ultimate threat. But here is the silver lining, the opportunity in the SWOT matrix. This 2-week ceasefire is a golden, albeit narrow, window. The international community is exhausted by this conflict. There is a real appetite to offer sanctions relief and reconstruction aid, but only if Iran pivots to a transitional framework. Regional powers want stability. They want the oil flowing.
So, yielding is the only way to unlock those opportunities. It is a bitter pill for a leadership built on the ideology of unyielding defiance. But the synthesis of all this analysis is undeniable. To refuse concession now isn't bravery. It is strategic suicide.
It is the difference between ideology and realism. A transitional government, one that is broad-based, monitored, and committed to denuclearization and economic reopening, is the only bridge back to the future. It is a chance to rebuild infrastructure, stabilize the economy, and give the citizens a chance to breathe.
It really forces a shift in perspective. We are so conditioned to view ceasefires and concessions as a loss of power. But in this context, Stepping aside and supporting a transitional authority is the ultimate exercise of agency. It is choosing survival and dignity over absolute ruin.
And that is the heaviest burden of leadership. Knowing when the war is over, even if you didn't win it. The window is open right now in Islamabad. The decisions made in those negotiating rooms will dictate whether a nation of over 80 million people steps into a new era of recovery or falls into a dark age of fragmentation.
History is an incredibly unforgiving judge, and the clock is ticking loudly on this 2-week pause. It leaves you with a haunting thought. Sometimes, the most revolutionary act a deeply entrenched system can take is to simply let go. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into the 2026 crisis. We will be watching those Islamabad talks closely, and we hope this breakdown gives you a new lens through which to view the headlines. Keep questioning the narrative, and we will catch you next time.